welcome. Welcome to Paradise. Well, Paradise Island, actually. It used to be called Hog Island, but in 1959, a man named Huntington Hartford changed all of that. He bought most of the island here, and for obvious reasons, I think, changed the name to Paradise Island. My name is Bill Whobrey. I've lectured in medieval studies at Yale University and Stanford, and I'd like to be your guide today and show you around this beautiful cloister, this medieval structure that we have here in the Bahamas. We'll be doing a three-part series. The first part will be focused on the medieval history, where this structure came from originally in France. The second part is how it got here in the 20th century. And then the third part will be showing you some of the architectural elements here and how we think this building was originally put together. Our cloisters comes from several monasteries and their own cloisters that were once located in southwestern France. In and near the city of Toulouse, a major city today, the various monasteries, among them those in Auch, in Bonnefond, Tarbes, and Montreuil, contributed elements of their own architecture and cloisters to the one in Paradise Island. Now, Toulouse was a major city in the Middle Ages, as well as being a major city today. It was a center for trade, for culture, and also a religious center. As a home to several monastic orders in the 13th and 14th century, Toulouse was the first and primary home to the order of the Dominicans, the preaching friars. St. Dominic preached here in this area and founded his order in 1221. Probably the most famous among the Dominicans, someone still revered today, is St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas Aquinas was also a major theologian and teacher of the 13th century and is in fact buried today at the Dominican monastery in Toulouse. Here we see the Jacobin Dominican monastery as it is today, not active as a monastery, but we see the beautiful cloister and the garden and the trees in the middle. Another major order that arose in the Middle Ages of monks were the Augustinians. The Augustinians named themselves after St. Augustine. He's depicted here and in many paintings as a medieval monk, but in fact, unlike Dominic, Augustine was a monk really of the late Roman Empire. St. Augustine died in 430 in North Africa, so of course he had nothing to do directly, as did Dominic, with the order, but he did establish a rule, a way of living for monks that was then taken up by the Augustinian order in 1256. Probably the most famous monk, Augustinian monk, although we don't often associate him with that order, was Martin Luther. Martin Luther, for many years, had been a monk, a teacher, professor, priest in the Augustinian order in Germany. Now, the Augustinians from 1256 on spread quickly and widely throughout France. You can see their influence in many, many different places in France and throughout Europe and beyond Europe. And here you see evidence that, in fact, it was the Augustinian order that founded our own Villanova University in the U.S. The Augustinian monastery in Toulouse was founded in 1269 outside the walls, but it was then later completed in 1396 as a monastery where it stands today. In 1795, it was no longer a monastery, but had at that time then been converted to a museum. a museum of art, which it is still today. It has beautiful examples of medieval art and modern art as well. Here we see also some examples of its beautiful cloister, the beautiful arches and columns that form its arcades, and the garden in the center.
So what is a cloister exactly? Well, it comes from the Latin word claustrum, which means enclosed. So you can see here, it's an enclosed space. We still have that in our word in English, for instance, in claustrophobia, if you're afraid of enclosed spaces. But in the Middle Ages, in a monastery, this was the place that was reserved for monks. It was their enclosure, their cloister. And they could use this space to walk, to sit, to pray, to meditate. And as you can see, the outside lends itself to making a very nice garden.
And we see here in a schematic what the various buildings of the monastery look like. We have, of course, the main building of any monastery, the church itself. And then, as we see in almost all monastic plans, the cloister right next to the church. Here's another view that shows us in 3 dimensions what this generally looks like. A church on either end of the cloister, which is attached next to it as a kind of arcade and covered pathway between various buildings that then has an opening at the center for its own garden.
So this particular cloister is made up of different elements, actually, from different monasteries in the Middle Ages. They were reassembled here, but originally came from different cloisters in southwestern France around the area of Toulouse. We can date most of the structure here to late 14th century. So it is Gothic, and we see that from the archways and from the different elements. But we also know that it didn't come from a single monastery, and it wasn't originally in this configuration.
In the region close to the Pyrenees, we see examples of beautiful cloisters, such as the one depicted here from Saint-Bertrand, with the very familiar now double capital arcade. This example from Saint-Lizier in Val-Cabrère. And then we also see examples in today's landscape of monasteries once grand but now gone and all but forgotten. Here we see an example of the Cistercian monastery of Bonnefond. And we can see here where once the cloister stood, but is no longer. Another example is this area here, just next to the church at Saint-Just. And then we have this example from the town of Auch, of the monastery of the Cordeliers, which was a Franciscan offshoot. And you can see that part of the cloister still stands, but the rest of it has been removed, although it does still function during the summertime as a very nice Italian restaurant. Of course, what happened to these monasteries? Well, some of them really did disappear into the countryside, as it were, but others found new homes, and so these beautiful cloister buildings would be resurrected and rebuilt in the 19th century. Here we have a very nice example from the town of Saint-Gaudens in this same area, and we have here a beautiful cloister which has been rebuilt 3 sides up on a hill in a park. Another example very similar to that is not too far away in the town of Tarbes. You can see here even early 20th century gatherings in the park, where this cloister then became a favorite feature. What we see here is a book called the Orbis Augustinianus, this particular version published in 1672, and what it is a compilation of all of the monasteries that belonged to the Augustinian order, an attempt to really catalog all of them, both their history as well as their location. We can see here the entry for our own Augustinian monastery in Montrejau, in Latin Montis Regalis, and as it says here, as we also know in French, what it means essentially is Montreal, which we know is a famous city in Canada as well. This area in Gascony, Montrejau, is near the Garonne River and the Nest River in an area known as Comminges. This area, as we can see here from an aerial view, is beautiful with lakes and rivers running through it. The monastery itself is outside of town, outside of the old historic center, along the Rue du Parc. Now, if you travel down the small Rue du Parc, as I did, and I asked this gentleman walking down the street where I could find the monastery, well, he pointed me to an entryway, a not very attractive church, actually from the 19th century, guards the way into what we see now of that once beautiful monastery in Montrejau, and what's left is essentially a parking lot. You can see here a building from the 19th century that was then built on the site of the monastery, but at that point, what was once such a majestic collection of buildings is completely gone. What you do still find, now posted on one of the windows of the church, is a reference to the cloisters in Paradise Island, and in fact, telling us that we can find the remnants of the cloister of Montrejau here in the Bahamas on Paradise Island.
Well, that's the end of part one, so thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, learned a little bit about the medieval history of cloisters here in the Bahamas, and join us for part two, where we'll be talking about how the structure actually arrived here in the Bahamas, of all places, in the 1960s. See you then.